The fluorescent lights of the municipal courthouse in the small town of Havenwood hummed with a relentless, sterile energy, a stark contrast to the knot of anxiety tightening in Sergeant Major, retired Sam Peterson's chest. At 72, Sam was a man carved from old oak, his posture still ramrod straight despite the subtle tremor in his hands, a legacy of years spent handling heavy ordnance. His face, a road map of wrinkles etched by sun and worry, was set in a stoic mask, the same one he'd worn through 3 deployments in the Middle East. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. He sat on a hard, uncomfortable wooden bench outside courtroom 3, the worn fabric of his tweed jacket doing little to ward off the chill of the air conditioning. Across from him, fidgeting like a trapped bird, was Mrs. Henderson, his neighbor. A sweet woman in her late 60s, prone to a fluttery nervousness, she had unfortunately been the unwitting recipient of Sam's minor transgression. The charge against him was, frankly, ludicrous. Excessive noise violation. It stemmed from an incident 2 weeks prior. Late one afternoon, a group of teenagers had been loitering near his property, their portable speaker blasting a genre of music Sam couldn't even begin to categorize, a cacophony of distorted bass and unintelligible lyrics. He politely asked them to turn it down, but his request had been met with sneers and a further increase in volume. Sam, a man who valued peace and quiet, especially in his own home, had reached his limit. He'd retrieved his old bugle, a cherished memento from his military days, and given a short, sharp blast of reveille. The teenagers, startled by the unexpected sound, had scattered, but not before one of them, a particularly surly youth with bright blue hair, had muttered something about crazy old coots. Mrs. Henderson, whose prize-winning petunias bordered Sam's yard, had been enjoying a quiet afternoon tea on her porch when the bugle sounded. The sudden, sharp note had startled her, causing her to spill hot tea on her lap. While thankfully not seriously burned, she had been shaken and, prompted by her well-meaning but somewhat officious daughter, had reluctantly filed a noise complaint with the town. Sam hadn't thought much of it at the time, dismissing it as a neighborly misunderstanding. He'd even offered Mrs. Henderson an apology and a new bag of her favorite Earl Grey tea. But the wheels of bureaucracy, once set in motion, ground inexorably forward. A summons had arrived a week later, demanding his presence in court. He glanced at Mrs. Henderson, whose eyes darted nervously towards the courtroom door. He felt a pang of guilt. He never intended to cause her distress. He simply wanted the noise to stop. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who had endured the roar of artillery and the cacophony of battle was now facing legal action over a single bugle blast. His lawyer, a young, slightly rumpled woman named Sarah Chin, had assured him it was a minor charge, likely to result in a small fine at worst. But, she'd cautioned, we should still be respectful and present our case clearly. The courtroom door creaked open, and a bailiff, a portly man with a bored expression, called out, "All rise. The Honorable Judge Thompson presiding." Sam stood, his military bearing ingrained, even in this mundane setting. He followed Sarah into the small courtroom, its worn wooden benches and the slightly raised platform where Judge Thompson would sit exuding an air of somber authority. Mrs. Henderson trailed behind them, her steps hesitant. The courtroom was sparsely filled. A few other individuals waiting for their cases, a court reporter tapping away silently at her machine, and the town prosecutor, a young man with an air of confident impatience, already standing at his table. Judge Thompson, a woman with a kind face framed by silver hair, entered and settled behind the bench. She surveyed the room with a calm, steady gaze. "Good morning, everyone. Let's get started. The first case on the docket is Peterson, Samuel, noise violation." The prosecutor, Mr. Davies, stepped forward. "Your Honor, the prosecution alleges that on the afternoon of October 27th, the defendant, Mr. Samuel Peterson, willfully and excessively created loud noise, disturbing the peace and quiet of his neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Henderson." He gestured towards Mrs. Henderson, who flinched slightly. Sarah Chen rose to her feet. "Your Honor, while we acknowledge the incident occurred, We believe the circumstances and Mr. Peterson's character will demonstrate that this was not a willful act of disturbance but rather a momentary lapse in judgment in response to a disruptive situation. Judge Thompson nodded. Mr. Davies, would you like to call your witness? Mr. Davies called Mrs. Henderson to the stand. She recounted the incident, her voice trembling slightly, emphasizing her shock and the spilled tea. Mr. Davies presented a photograph of her slightly stained cardigan as evidence. Sarah Chen's cross-examination was gentle. She focused on Mrs. Henderson's well-being, her beautiful garden, and elicited that Mrs. Henderson believed Sam to be a generally good and quiet neighbor. Mrs. Henderson, Sarah asked, her voice soft but clear, would you say that Mr. Peterson has ever intentionally caused you harm or distress before this incident? Oh, no, dear, Mrs. Henderson replied quickly. Never. He's always been a gentleman. Sarah nodded. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. Now it was Sam's turn to take the stand. He walked with a quiet dignity, his gaze meeting Judge Thompson's directly. Mr. Davies' questioning was straightforward, focusing on his actions and his possession of the bugle. Mr. Peterson, Mr. Davies asked, a slight edge to his voice. Why do you own a bugle? It was issued to me during my service in the United States Army, sir. Sam replied, his voice steady. I served for 22 years. Mr. Davies paused, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. And what was your rank upon retirement, Mr. Peterson? Sergeant Major. A ripple of quiet murmuring went through the small courtroom. Sergeant Major was a rank held by very few, a sign of exceptional service and dedication. Mr. Davies seemed momentarily taken aback. Judge Thompson leaned forward slightly, her expression now more attentive. Mr. Peterson, you served in the Army? Yes, Your Honor. Signal Corps, initially. Then later combat engineer. And where did you serve? She inquired further, a hint of personal interest in her tone. Sam hesitated for a fraction of a second. Some memories were best left buried. But the question was direct. Lebanon, ma'am. Then 2 tours in Iraq. The murmuring in the courtroom intensified. Mr. Davies stood silently, his prepared questions seemingly forgotten for a moment. The air in the room had shifted, the triviality of the noise violation suddenly overshadowed by the weight of Sam Peterson's unspoken history. The courtroom, already hushed, seemed to draw a collective breath. Judge Thompson's gaze softened, losing some of its judicial sternness and taking on a more personal, almost reverent quality. She had family who had served, a brother who had seen action in Desert Storm. The words Lebanon and Iraq resonated with a gravity that far outweighed the minor offense of a bugle blast. Sergeant Major Peterson, Judge Thompson said, her voice now imbued with a quiet respect. That is a significant record of service. Could you briefly tell the court about the circumstances leading to the bugle incident? Sam shifted slightly on the stand. He wasn't used to talking about himself, much less in a formal setting like this. His life had been one of action, not explanation. Your Honor, he began, his voice still steady but carrying the weight of unspoken years. I live alone. My property backs onto a small wooded area, and for some time now, groups of teenagers have been gathering there. Mostly it's harmless. But on this particular afternoon, their music was exceptionally loud. Disruptive. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I'm an old man, Your Honor. I value my peace. I went out and asked them politely to lower the volume. They declined. In fact, they increased it. Mr. Davies, the prosecutor, who had been observing this exchange with a growing unease, seemed to find his footing again. And so, Mr. Peterson, you decided to take matters into your own hands with a military instrument? He interjected, a hint of his earlier prosecutorial zeal returning, though somewhat blunted. The bugle was the first thing that came to mind, sir, Sam admitted. It's an instrument designed to get attention, to cut through noise. My intention wasn't to cause alarm to Mrs. Henderson, or anyone else for that matter. It was simply to disperse the individuals causing the disturbance. And it worked. They left immediately. At the cost of startling your neighbor and, as she testified, causing her to spill hot tea. Davies pressed. For which I am truly sorry, Sam said, turning his gaze briefly to Mrs. Henderson, who offered a small, understanding nod. It was an impulsive act born of frustration. Not malice. Judge Thompson tapped her pen lightly on her notepad. Mr. Peterson, this bugle, do you play it often? A rare, faint smile touched Sam's lips. Not as often as I used to, Your Honor. In the service, it was part of daily life. Reveille to wake us, taps to lay us to rest. Calls for assembly, for mail, for chow. It was a voice, a constant companion. He looked down at his hands, the tremor more noticeable now. Now it's mostly a reminder of a different time. A different life. The courtroom was silent. The narrative had subtly shifted. This was no longer just about a noise violation. It was about a man, a veteran, whose past was suddenly, unexpectedly, illuminating the present. The image of this stoic sergeant major, a man who had faced down far greater cacophonies, resorting to his old service bugle to deal with a neighborhood nuisance, was both poignant and, in a strange way, understandable. Sarah Chin, Sam's lawyer, saw her opening. Your Honor, she said, rising. I believe Mr. Peterson has clearly explained his actions and his intent. He is a man who has dedicated over 2 decades of his life to serving this country, enduring hardships most of us can only imagine. He sought a peaceful resolution to a disturbance, and when that failed, he used a tool familiar to him, albeit one perhaps unsuited for a quiet suburban afternoon. She continued, the prosecution has shown no pattern of disruptive behavior from Mr. Peterson. Mrs. Henderson herself testified to him being a good neighbor. This was an isolated incident, a misjudgment, perhaps, but not a malicious act deserving of a criminal record, however minor. Judge Thompson looked from Sam to Mr. Davies, then to Mrs. Henderson, who was dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. The prosecutor, Mr. Davies, seemed to be wrestling with himself. The initial confidence he displayed was gone, replaced by a more thoughtful, almost hesitant demeanor. The weight of Sam's service record, spoken so plainly and without embellishment, had clearly had an impact. He knew that pressing hard for a conviction now, on such a trivial charge against such a man, might not sit well, not just with the judge, but with his own conscience, and indeed, with the small town of Havenwood should word get out. The story of a decorated sergeant major being hauled into court for playing reveille to disperse some noisy teens was not the kind of press the prosecutor's office, or the town, generally welcomed. The very air of the courtroom seemed to plead for a different kind of justice, one tempered with understanding and respect. Mr. Davies cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet courtroom. He was a young man, ambitious, keen to make his mark, but he was not without sense or empathy. He had prepared for a straightforward, minor offense case. What he hadn't prepared for was the quiet dignity of a sergeant major whose service record was a testament to a life lived with honor and sacrifice. The photograph of Mrs. Henderson's tea-stained cardigan, which had seemed like a crucial piece of evidence an hour ago, now felt almost embarrassingly trivial. He glanced at his notes, then at Sam Peterson, then at Judge Thompson, whose expression was thoughtful and unreadable. He knew he had a duty to prosecute, but he also understood the unwritten rules of a small town like Havenwood, where reputation and community sentiment mattered. Pushing for a harsh penalty, or even a formal conviction that would mar the record of a man like Sam Peterson, felt increasingly wrong. Your Honor, Mr. Davies began, his voice more subdued than before. The state acknowledges Mr. Peterson's significant military service. It was certainly not our intention to cause undue distress to a man who has given so much to this country. He paused, as if weighing his next words very carefully. However, the fact remains that a disturbance occurred, and Mrs. Henderson was, by her own testimony, startled and inconvenienced. He continued, Perhaps there is a way to resolve this matter that acknowledges both the disruption and the unique circumstances we've learned about today. The primary concern here is the peace of the neighborhood. Judge Thompson listened intently, her fingers steepled. She turned her gaze to Sam. Mr. Peterson, you've heard the prosecutor. You've expressed your regret for startling Mrs. Henderson. Do you have anything further you wish to say before I consider this matter? Sam looked at the judge, then briefly at Mrs. Henderson, who offered him another small, encouraging smile. He wasn't a man of many words, especially in his own defense. Your Honor, he said simply, I've always tried to be a good neighbor. I understand that my actions, however unintentional in their consequence towards Mrs. Henderson, were abrupt. If there's a way to make amends beyond my apology, I'm willing to consider it. His voice was devoid of self-pity, only a quiet sincerity. Judge Thompson nodded. She looked at the file before her, at the simple complaint form, then up at the American flag standing in the corner of the courtroom. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to fade as a different kind of silence settled, one of contemplation. This court, Judge Thompson began, her voice filling the room with a quiet authority, is a place of law. And the law, in its ideal form, seeks justice and ensures the peaceful cohabitation of our citizens. We have ordinances, like the one Mr. Peterson is charged with violating, designed to maintain that peace. On the face of it, a noise was made, a neighbor was disturbed. A technical violation may have occurred. She paused, her gaze sweeping across Sam, then Mr. Davies, then Sarah Chin. However, the law is also meant to be applied with wisdom and discretion, taking into account the full context of a situation, including the character and intent of the individuals involved. She looked directly at Sam. Sergeant Major Peterson, your service to this nation is not a direct defense against a noise violation. But it speaks volumes about your character, your discipline, and your commitment to principles that go far beyond the letter of a local ordinance. It tells me that you are not a man who would willfully or maliciously disturb his neighbors. She then turned to Mr. Davies. Mr. Davies, I appreciate your willingness to consider alternative resolutions. It shows good judgment. The judge leaned back in her chair. It seems to me that the heart of this matter is a desire for community harmony. Mrs. Henderson was startled. Mr. Peterson regrets this. The initial disturbance caused by the teenagers, while not before this court, was the catalyst. She looked at Sam again. Mr. Peterson, your bugle. You said it was a voice, a constant companion. In the military, its calls serve specific, orderly purposes. Reveille is a call to rise, to begin the day's duties. It is, by its nature, meant to be heard. A faint smile played on her lips. Perhaps its use in a suburban setting to disperse loiterers was a tactical misapplication. Sam couldn't help but return a slight smile. Perhaps so, Your Honor. Given the circumstances, Judge Thompson continued, given Mr. Peterson's exemplary record, his clear remorse, and Mrs. Henderson's own testimony that he is otherwise a good neighbor, I am not inclined to enter a formal conviction for this offense. A sigh of relief was almost audible from Sarah Chin and Mrs. Henderson. However, the judge added, holding up a hand, the peace was indeed disturbed. Mr. Davies, Ms. Chin, I propose the following. Mr. Peterson, instead of a fine or a formal conviction, I am going to ask you to do two things. First, to offer a more formal, perhaps written, apology to Mrs. Henderson, just to ensure she knows your regret is sincere. Second, I am going to sentence you, Sergeant Major, to share some of your experiences, not necessarily the difficult ones, but perhaps some of your knowledge about discipline, community, or even the history of that bugle, with a local youth group or at the high school. Perhaps the very teenagers who caused the initial disturbance might benefit from hearing from a man like you. She looked at Sam. Do you find these terms acceptable, Mr. Peterson? Sam considered for a moment. He wasn't much for public speaking, but the idea of talking to young people, of perhaps imparting something of value, wasn't entirely unappealing. And it was certainly preferable to a fine or a mark on his record. More importantly, it felt like a constructive, honorable way out of this mess. Yes, Your Honor, Sam said, his voice firm. I find those terms acceptable. And I thank you? Judge Thompson smiled. Very well. Mr. Davies, is the prosecution amenable to dismissing the charge upon Mr. Peterson's fulfillment of these conditions? Mr. Davies, looking relieved himself, nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The State agrees. Excellent. Judge Thompson banged her gavel lightly. Case dismissed, pending fulfillment of the agreed-upon conditions. Let this serve as a reminder that communication, and a little understanding, can often resolve our differences far more effectively than sudden blasts of noise. Court is adjourned for a brief recess. As Judge Thompson's gavel fell, a quiet wave of relief washed over Sam Peterson. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The tightness in his chest eased, replaced by a weary lightness. Sarah Chin, his lawyer, gave his arm a congratulatory squeeze, her smile genuine. Well done, Sergeant Major, she whispered. You handled that perfectly. Mrs. Henderson, her eyes still a little teary, approached him as they stepped out into the corridor, which now seemed brighter, less oppressive. Oh, Samuel, she said, her voice trembling slightly but full of warmth. I'm so glad it turned out this way. I never wanted any trouble for you. It was all just a misunderstanding, really. Sam met her gaze, his own expression softening. The gruff exterior he often presented to the world seemed to crack, revealing the decent man beneath. Eleanor, he said, using her first name, a rarity. The fault was mine. My actions were inconsiderate, regardless of the provocation. I truly am sorry for startling you and for any distress I caused. Oh, think nothing of it, Samuel. She fluttered, though her relieved smile indicated it had indeed been something. A written apology isn't necessary, you know. Your word is good enough for me. Nevertheless, Sam insisted gently. The judge suggested it, and I believe it's the proper thing to do. I'll bring it by this afternoon, if that's all right. That would be lovely, Samuel, she said, beaming now. Perhaps you'll stay for a cup of tea? My new batch of Earl Grey just arrived. Sam managed a small smile. I'd like that very much, Eleanor. Mr. Davies, the prosecutor, approached them, his earlier adversarial stance gone. He extended a hand towards Sam. Sergeant Major Peterson, he said, his tone respectful. No hard feelings, I hope. I was just doing my job. Sam shook his hand. Understood, son. You do what you have to. Your service, it's an honor to have men like you in our community. Davies added, a touch awkwardly, then nodded to Sarah and Mrs. Henderson before heading off. Later that afternoon, true to his word, Sam penned a short, sincere note of apology to Mrs. Henderson. Writing it felt right, a formal acknowledgement of his misstep. When he delivered it, she ushered him into her cozy, sunlit kitchen, filled with the scent of baking. The spilled tea incident seemed forgotten, or at least forgiven, as they shared a cup of her excellent Earl Grey and a plate of freshly baked scones. They talked about their gardens, the weather, the goings-on in Havenwood, the comfortable, easy chat of neighbors at peace with one another. It was the most relaxed Sam had felt in weeks. As he walked home, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows, Sam's thoughts turned to the second part of Judge Thompson's sentence. Speaking to the youth, a new kind of anxiety began to prickle at him. What on earth would he say? He was a soldier, a man of action in few words, not a public speaker or a storyteller. The idea of standing before a group of teenagers, especially ones who might include the very culprits who'd caused the initial problem, filled him with a sense of trepidation far greater than facing a judge. He imagined their bored faces, their fidgeting, their whispered comments. What did he know about connecting with today's youth? Their music, their slang, their world seemed alien to him. He didn't want to preach, or sound like a rambling old man glorifying war. His service was a part of him, a defining part, but much of it was grim, filled with experiences he rarely spoke of, even to himself. The bugle. Judge Thompson had mentioned the bugle. Perhaps that was a starting point. It was tangible. It had a history, a purpose. He could talk about its calls, what they meant in the daily life of a soldier, the discipline, the order, the shared experience. But could he make that interesting to a generation raised on instant digital everything? He reached his small, quiet house. The silence that he usually cherished now felt heavy with unspoken questions. His old bugle lay on the mantelpiece, polished brass gleaming faintly in the fading light. It had called men to action, to duty, to remembrance. Now, it seemed, it was calling him to a new, unfamiliar kind of engagement, one that would require a different kind of courage than he had ever needed on the battlefield. He picked it up, its cold metal familiar in his trembling hands. He had faced down enemy fire, but the thought of facing a roomful of teenagers with nothing but his words and an old brass instrument made his palms sweat. The next few days found Sam Peterson in an uncharacteristic state of unease. The prospect of the youth talk loomed large, a new kind of campaign for which he felt entirely unequipped. He paced his small living room, the floorboards creaking under his measured tread, occasionally picking up the bugle, turning it over in his hands, as if seeking guidance from its silent brass curves. What wisdom could he, a man whose most profound communications had often been wordless, a nod, a hand signal, the understood language of soldiers under pressure, possibly impart to a generation that communicated in acronyms and fleeting digital images? He considered Judge Thompson's suggestion, talk about discipline, community, the bugle's history. It sounded reasonable in the abstract, but how to translate those concepts into something engaging, something that wouldn't elicit eye rolls and glazed expressions? He pulled out an old footlocker from the back of his closet, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, nestled amongst neatly folded uniforms and faded photographs, were mementos of his service, a few medals in their velvet boxes, a worn leather-bound journal with sparse entries, a tattered map of a forgotten sector. He picked up a small, framed photo of a group of young men, himself among them, their faces grimy but grinning, somewhere in the dusty landscape of Iraq. So many of them hadn't made it back, or had returned irrevocably changed. How could he speak of service without touching upon its terrible cost? And how could he do that for an audience of unformed minds without either traumatizing them, or inadvertently glorifying the very thing he knew to be so devastating? Sarah Chin called him a few days later. "Sergeant Major, just checking in? The court clerk contacted me. They've spoken to Havenwood High. The principal, Ms. Evans, is very keen on your talk. She suggested next Thursday afternoon, during the last period. It would be an optional assembly for juniors and seniors. Does that work for you?" "Next Thursday," Sam repeated, his stomach giving a little lurch. It felt too soon. "I suppose it will have to, Miss Chin." "Are you all right, Sergeant Major?" she asked, sensing his hesitation. "Nervous?" "A little out of my depth, perhaps," Sam admitted, a rare confession. "Not exactly my usual field of operations." "Just be yourself, Sam," Sarah said kindly. "Tell them what you know. Speak from the heart. You have a wealth of experience. Even if only one or two of them truly listen, you'll have made a difference." Her words offered a small measure of comfort. Speak from the heart. But his heart, when it came to his service, was a complicated, heavily guarded place. He decided to focus on the bugle itself, as Judge Thompson had hinted. He researched its history more formally, beyond his own lived experience with it. He looked up the origins of the calls. Reveille, first call, assembly, mess call, taps. Each had a story, a function, a role in knitting together the fabric of military life, creating order and shared understanding amidst chaos. He thought about discipline, not as a form of punishment, but as a framework for achieving goals, for self-reliance, for teamwork. He remembered the grueling marches, the meticulous care of equipment, the absolute necessity of depending on the soldier next to you. Could he convey that without sounding like a drill sergeant? One evening, Mrs. Henderson, Eleanor, came over with a plate of cookies. She'd heard about the upcoming talk from the town's ever-efficient grapevine. "Samuel," she said, settling into his worn armchair, "don't you fret too much about those youngsters. My grandson, young Michael, he complains about school, but he told me he's actually curious to hear you speak. Says it's better than double math." Sam chuckled, a dry, rusty sound. "High praise indeed. Just tell them a story, Samuel," she advised gently. "Everyone loves a good story. And you must have a few. A story. Not a lecture. Not a sermon. Just a story." The idea took root. Perhaps he could frame his thoughts around a particular experience, something that illustrated the points he wanted to make without being overly didactic or grim. He thought back to his first deployment, to the bewildering sense of being a young soldier in a foreign land, and how the familiar calls of the bugle had been an anchor, a thread of continuity in an uncertain world. He began to jot down a few notes on a yellow legal pad. Bugle, not just noise but language. Discipline, not just rules, but strength, inner and outer. Teamwork, relying on others, being reliable. Service, what does it mean? Beyond military. He still felt a knot of apprehension, but now, mixed with it, was a flicker of something else. A sense of challenge, yes, but also a hint of purpose. This was his new assignment, given by a judge instead of a commanding officer. And Sergeant Major Samuel Peterson, retired or not, had never been one to shirk a duty. He would prepare. He would do his best. The thought of those teenagers, especially the ones who had caused the initial trouble, listening to him was still daunting, but now, he also felt a responsibility to try and reach them, to offer them something more than just another adult telling them what to do. The auditorium at Havenwood High buzzed with the low hum of restless teenagers. It was last period on a Thursday, and the promise of an early dismissal for those attending the optional assembly had ensured a decent turnout, though genuine enthusiasm was perhaps in shorter supply. Sam Peterson stood backstage, if the small curtained-off area beside the stage could be called that, his palms sweating. He clutched his polished bugle, its brass cool against his skin, a familiar weight in an unfamiliar situation. Ms. Evans, the principal, a woman with a kind smile and an air of calm authority, gave him an encouraging nod. "They're a good bunch, Sergeant Major," she said. "A little restless on a Thursday afternoon, but they'll listen. Just speak from your experience." Sam nodded, not entirely convinced. He could see, through a crack in the curtain, rows of young faces, some curious, some indifferent, some already looking at their phones despite the pre-assembly warning. He spotted a flash of bright blue hair towards the back, one of the youths from the park. His stomach tightened another notch. Ms. Evans stepped onto the stage. "Good afternoon, students. Today, we have a special guest, a member of our Havenwood community, Sergeant Major Samuel Peterson, retired from the U.S. Army. He's here to share some of his experiences and insights with us. Please give him a respectful Havenwood welcome." A smattering of applause, polite but unenergetic, rippled through the auditorium. Sam took a deep breath, the kind he used to take before a difficult patrol, and walked onto the stage. The lights felt brighter, hotter than he'd anticipated. He adjusted the microphone, his hand still trembling slightly. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice a little hoarse at first. He cleared his throat. "Thank you, Principal Evans, for that introduction. And thank you all for being here." He looked out at the sea of young faces. "I'm not much of a public speaker. My work, for many years, involved, well, different kinds of communication." He held up the bugle. "This is a bugle. Most of you have probably seen one, maybe in old movies or parades. To some, it might just be a noisy piece of brass. But in the Army, for soldiers, it was a voice. It was our clock, our messenger, sometimes even our comfort." He decided to start with something tangible, something he knew. "It doesn't have valves or keys like a trumpet," he explained, turning it over. "All the notes, all the calls, are made just with the player's breath and lips. It takes discipline to play it well, to make it speak clearly." He talked about reveille. Not the way he'd played it in his yard, but what it truly meant, the start of a demanding day, a call to duty, the promise of shared effort. He described the sound of it echoing across a cold, misty field at dawn, a signal that, no matter how tired you were, you weren't alone. He then spoke of taps. Its mournful, poignant notes. He didn't dwell on death or battles, but on its role in signaling the end of the day, a time for rest, for reflection, and for remembering comrades. He saw a few students straighten up, their attention caught not by a lecture, but by the image he was painting. The blue-haired youth was still slouched, but his gaze was fixed on Sam, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Sam then shifted, hesitantly, to the idea of discipline. Discipline, he said, isn't just about punishment or following orders blindly. It's about training yourself. It's about being able to rely on yourself, so others can rely on you. Whether you're part of a squad on a mission, a team on a sports field, or even a group working on a school project, that self-discipline, that commitment to doing your part, is what holds things together. He shared a brief, carefully chosen anecdote from his time as a young engineer, not about combat, but about a bridge-building exercise under difficult conditions, where teamwork and every individual's meticulous attention to their task were critical to success. He spoke of the satisfaction of achieving something difficult together, a structure built not just of steel and wood, but of trust and shared effort. He didn't speak for too long, mindful of their attention spans. As he neared his conclusion, he looked directly at the section where he'd seen the blue-haired teenager. "This bugle," he said, his voice softer now. "It's a part of my history. It's a reminder of a life of service. Service doesn't always mean wearing a uniform. It means contributing to your community, looking out for your neighbors, respecting the peace and quiet that allows everyone to live well. Sometimes, even an old soldier can forget the best way to communicate that respect." He offered a small, self-deprecating smile. "But it's never too late to learn, or to try and make things right." He finished by saying, "Thank you for listening." He then raised the bugle to his lips. He didn't play reveille. Instead, he played a few clear, simple notes from Assembly, the call for soldiers to gather, to come together. The notes were not loud, not startling, but clear and resonant in the quiet auditorium. When he finished, there was a moment of silence, then applause started, warmer this time, more sustained. Several students were looking at him with a newfound interest, perhaps even respect. As he walked off the stage, Ms. Evans met him with a wide smile. "That was wonderful, Sergeant Major," she said. "Truly. I think you reached them." Sam wasn't so sure he'd reached all of them, but as he glanced back, he saw the blue-haired teenager slowly clapping, his expression no longer surly, but thoughtful. Perhaps, Sam thought, a few notes had indeed cut through the static. The days following Sam Peterson's talk at Havenwood High were quieter, both externally and internally. The initial anxiety had given way to a sense of quiet accomplishment. He hadn't delivered a grand oration, nor had he expected to, but he had faced a personal challenge and fulfilled his obligation to the court and, in a way, to himself. He found that the experience, while nerve-wracking, had been surprisingly invigorating. Ms. Evans called a week later to thank him again. "You wouldn't believe the conversations your talk sparked, Sergeant Major," she said. "Some of the students are now asking about local history, about the roles of veterans in our community. A few have even inquired about volunteer opportunities. You've planted some very positive seeds." Sam was genuinely pleased, though he accepted the praise with his usual modesty. He hadn't expected such an outcome. His intention had simply been to fulfill his sentence, and perhaps offer a different perspective. One afternoon, as he was tending his tomato plants, a familiar flash of blue caught his eye. The blue-haired teenager from the park, the one who had been at the assembly, was standing awkwardly at the edge of his yard. Sam straightened up, a little wary. Mr. Peterson?" the boy said, his voice surprisingly hesitant. He scuffed his sneaker on the sidewalk. "I'm Jake. Jake Miller." "Afternoon, Jake," Sam replied evenly. "Listen, about that day in the park, with the music. I just wanted to say sorry. We were being jerks." He looked down, then met Sam's gaze. "And your talk, it was pretty interesting. The stuff about the bugle calls. I didn't know any of that." Sam was taken aback by the apology, and the sincerity in the boy's voice. "Apology accepted, Jake," he said. "And I'm glad you found something of interest in what I had to say. My grandpa was in the Navy," Jake offered, then paused. "He doesn't talk about it much. But your bugle, it made me think." He shifted his weight. "Anyway. Just wanted to say that." He gave a quick, awkward nod and started to walk away. "Jake!" Sam called out. The boy stopped. "If you or your friends are ever interested in learning a bit more about the Bugle, or even just some local history, my door's usually open." Jake looked surprised, then a slow grin spread across his face. "Yeah? Cool. Maybe. Thanks, Mr. Peterson." And he was gone. Sam watched him go, a thoughtful expression on his face. Perhaps Judge Thompson's unconventional sentence had been wiser than he'd initially realized. It wasn't just about punishment, or even restitution. It was about connection, about bridging gaps. His relationship with Mrs. Henderson, Eleanor, had also blossomed. Their shared tea times became a regular occurrence. She'd bring baked goods, he'd share stories, not of war, but of his younger days, of travels, of the discipline and camaraderie of his service, carefully curated for her gentle ears. She, in turn, shared news of her grandchildren and her extensive knowledge of Havenwood's intricate social fabric. They found a comfortable companionship, two older residents of a small town who had, through a minor mishap, rediscovered the value of a good neighbor. The Bugle still sat on Sam's mantelpiece. But now, when he looked at it, he didn't just see a relic of his past or the instrument of a foolish mistake. He saw a tool that, even in its old age, even in his own, could still make a sound that mattered, could still call people together, not for battle, but for understanding. He even took to practicing a few of the simpler calls, softly, in the privacy of his backyard, the notes clear and true in the quiet Havenwood air. No longer a blast of frustration, but a gentle echo of a life of service, finding new resonance in the peaceful cadence of his retirement. He didn't become a town celebrity, nor did he want to. But something had shifted. He was no longer just a quiet, reclusive old man at the edge of town. He was Sergeant Major Peterson, a man with a history, a man who had, in his own way, answered a new call. The static that had once filled his quiet life had lessened, replaced by the clearer, more harmonious notes of community and connection. And for Sam, that was a kind of peace he hadn't realized he'd been missing.